Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Oh, okay.
How's
I
it
think I
going?
can hear you now. Doing
Awesome.
all right. I hope you'll excuse me, but I have some food to scarf down
No,
because I
please
was
do.
taking my I was with my girls at their tap class and just got home
Oh, that's
and
really cute.
threw some dinner together. So
Yes. Thanks to your wife and children for allowing us to borrow you. I don't know if you saw, and I'm going to say this now. So I just accepted my offer to the University of Chicago's Divinity School. Um,
you
I
did
did.
before even hearing from the other
I
ones.
did actually. So Yale waitlisted me, which is fine. And Exeter rejected me.
Ex Oxford or Exeter?
Well, I guess Oxford, but
Yeah, Oxford.
yeah, which is fine to be honest, because after I saw the offer from the Divinity School, I was pretty sure, like, considering it's overseas, there's not going to be funding, so I was pretty sure it was going to cost me way more to do that.
Yeah.
So yeah, but for those of you that don't know, Dan wrote one of my letters of recommendation, um, which I am eternally grateful for. And honestly, I was like crying for like 15 minutes before I hopped on live, just because I was like, I don't know, it's just like a big thing. Um,
Well, yeah, that is no small step. That's going to change the rest of your life. So,
Thank
congratulations.
you.
And
Yeah, I'm
that's
excited.
exciting.
It's it's a lot. But any event, yeah, please eat your food, and we'll go from there. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hello,
Well,
everyone.
it is. I don't, I've seen people eat on TikTok before. I don't know if I'm like a disgusting eater
I'm
on
sure you're
film,
fine.
but
I'm sure you're
I
fine.
don't know. Yeah, I have no idea.
So
I
I
guess
was
we shall see.
Yeah, I was just telling everyone. Sorry, I'm trying to get my phone to balance because it's like on the charger. Now we're just gonna do this. Oh well, I'll figure it out later. That's fine. Um, I was telling everyone that like I've been reading this book by Joel Baden on
Hmm.
like, what we can know historically about David. And as someone who grew up in the evangelical church, like it is wild to me how much I did not know. And that's like the best way I can phrase it. And I don't even think that the people in my church were trying to like hide things
Ob
from me. There we
right.
go. Yeah, I can.
Obfuscate is how
Yeah,
it
very
is.
smart. Um, listen, I'm going to a research university. Don't tell them I can't pronounce that word. Uh, uh, I just don't think they knew, or like, because like the people that were preaching at my church were not people that went to. I don't even think they went to seminary. If I'm being honest, it was just like they were a pastor.
Hmm.
But some of the things that I have been reading in this book and elsewhere has just been like super fascinating. Queen Heretic, it's Joel Baden, Baden. He's over at Yale. Yeah, sorry. Hi, Joel. Why did you waitlist me? I'm just kidding. It's fine. Um, but it's super interesting, right? Because like for one, this seems like the most obvious thing. I didn't realize that it says two places in the Bible that Goliath was slain by different people, right? So obviously there's one story of David, and it says that it's the whole narrative where David slays Goliath, and that's fine. But there's also another place in which it says, I believe the pronunciation is
Elkanan.
Elhanan. He slayed Goliath, right? And
Right.
it's like it's clearly the same Goliath. They're from the same place. They're both Philistines. Like it's the same person.
Right.
Um, and it's just like how how have I read the Bible so many times and I just like completely glanced right over that.
Well, the Bible's such a long text, it's impossible to keep all of it in our consciousness at the
Yeah.
same time. We pick
Right.
and choose what aspects, what stories, what characters we want to be thinking about and that we bring up to inform our experiences. And And it's just the case that when there's stuff that conflicts or complicates, what we do is reinterpret it away, and then we
Right.
never have to bring it up again. And so people don't, you'll never, well, I don't know about never, but you will very rarely hear someone preach about Onan. You will very rarely hear people preach about Elchanan. You will
Right. Yeah.
very rarely hear people preach about so many things that are so unusual, so weird. So Judges 19, the story that's the parallel to Genesis 19, people don't talk about that because it's horrific. And so, yeah, but what do we
Yeah.
got? 20. It's in 2 Samuel 21:19,
Yeah. Let me
and
find. Or sorry, go ahead. I'm just gonna pull up my notes.
and you've got Elhanan, the son of Ya're Orgim of the house of Bethlehem, but it says Beit Halachmi, so house of the bread, killed Goliath, the Gittite, and the passage in Chronicles is the renegotiation, and this Hebrew can be very carefully kind of reread to say that instead of Beit Halachmi, it could be um, or killed Et Ach, or no, Halachmi or Lachmi Ach um, Galiat or Galiot, which would be Lachmi, the brother of Goliath, and but that would have to be in the Aramaic square script where the tav and the chet
Mm-hmm.
look so similar, and so that would mean it would have this change would have been made in a later version of Hebrew, and so the text that says brother of Goliath is a secondary change that's intended to kind of make this problem go away,
Yeah.
and but I think the important thing that Joel notes, like the key to a lot of his readings, is the genre of the text. And
Yes.
that's something that is so important. It's something that when I am teaching Hebrew and when I am trying to walk people through biblical exegesis, if you understand the genre and you understand what the author is trying to accomplish, then that helps you put things into place. And that helps you solve a lot of otherwise confusing riddles. And so
Right.
Joel talks about this as apologetic, and that aids in figuring out why these stories are doing what they're doing.
Right.
And that reminds me of another. Oh, my microphone is in my headphones, so I can bring you with me.
Yeah. Look at you.
Um, let's see. I've got to find the book. There's another book on the historical David that came out around the same time period, but it was written by um, Jacob Wright. And he uses some stories about the Civil War. There it is. So, David, king of Israel, and Caleb in biblical memory. And it talks about the rise of Saul, the rise of David, and also Caleb as war commemoration, which is another kind of overlapping concept of the genre of the text, and uses the Civil War as kind of a template for how people wrote about Civil War generals, and how
Right.
we think about them today is parallel to how they were talking about David anciently. So that's another interesting
Yeah.
text on that story.
The video that I made today, I think, is like worth thinking about. And there's a reason that I made it the way that I did, right? Like I started off by saying, like, hey, if I told you a story about a guy who had no right to the throne, but sort of gained popularity by military success, and he was
Mm-hmm.
favored by his deity, and the
Mm-hmm.
king pursued him out of jealousy, and the this man professed his innocence the entire time and ended up taking the throne, even though by his station in life he had no right to it. Anyone that grew up in the church is thinking of David.
Right.
Anybody. But in reality, this is all from a 13th century BCE Hittite apology of, I can't even pronounce it, Hattusili,
Hattushili.
Hattusili, yeah, where like he was the younger brother of the king, and he didn't have a right to the throne because the king had a son, and he needed to, as Joel says, you have to, if you're creating an apology, it means you're apologizing for something, right? So like, what is it that you're trying to justify having done? And in both of these cases, it's not having a right to the throne and trying to justify why why people should follow your leadership, why they should be okay with you sort of usurping the throne.
Right.
And so like, this idea of genre, I think, is really important because even outside of this, like when I was sort of leaving evangelicalism and I started learning about the apocalyptic genre, that's what helped me sort of figure out the book of Revelation. Not like I know it perfectly or understand it perfectly, but like it made a whole bunch more sense when I understood like sort of the form and like narrative arc that the author was trying to, I don't know if replicate is the right word, but fit into, or just like, or follow. I don't know.
Well, it's like I use some illustrations when I talk about genre. I usually say if a story begins once upon a time, already you have a bunch of expectations about what the story is going to do, and you can follow those expectations, or you can overturn them. You can use genre expectations to surprise your audience,
or you can make it a polemic,
or you can make it a polemic. And another thing that I talk about is if you find a piece of paper on the ground in a parking lot somewhere and it says eggs, ground beef, orange juice, peanuts, what have you found? You found a shopping list. Everybody knows that this is a genre of text, and so you know precisely what it's used for. If you find it and some things are crossed off and some things aren't, you may even be able to reconstruct exactly what was done with the text without, and all that's information that is not provided by the text itself, but by your understanding of the genre. And so similarly, if we can identify the genre of text, we can figure out what they're trying to do and why they say things certain ways. And so that's always one of the keys of trying to interpret text, is figuring out what the genre is. And that's my paper on Psalm 82. One of my big things is saying this is actually two different genres and they're being wedded. It's a new hybrid genre. And that's how I make the argument for when Psalm 82 was written, what is it trying to accomplish? And so Joel, I think, does a good job of that. And somebody asked what the book we're talking about. It's Joel Baden's book, The Historical David, The Real Life of an Invented Hero.
Yep. Andrew asked that. Joel who?
Yeah.
Joel Baden. Yeah.
He's and if you don't know Joel Baden, he's on Twitter. He's a great follow on Twitter. Shares a lot of great information, mostly about the book of Leviticus. But
I thought I saw some Deuteronomy recently. Maybe I'm
wrong. A little bit. He's sprinkling some Deuteronomy in there as well. But he's at Yale. He's a wonderful scholar. He has written what many people think is the definitive defense of the documentary hypothesis. And that's available in a more academic version as well as in a more popular version. And he also works with Candida Moss quite a bit on. I'm having lunch with her next week.
Tell her I said hello.
I will do that. And
you two should have a podcast. Well, we would, but Dan already has a podcast, so we can't. It's too many podcasts.
And so he and Candida write on Museum of the Bible stuff. In fact, they published a book on what was it called?
I don't know, but Candida is awesome.
She's wonderful. Bible Nation, the United States of Hobby Lobby, by Candida Moss and Joel Baden. It's a wonderful discussion of that whole controversy. So if you're interested in that, I would say that is the book to get.
Absolutely. She also told me that my multicolored hair would be all the more reason for her to accept me into any graduate program she had stayed over. So I was like, you know what? Respect. But also, I did an interview with her on my channel. Dan already knows this, but for everybody else, on her book, The Myth of Persecution. And I think if you are someone who hears Christians saying, like, well, why would so many people die for their faith if it like wasn't a real thing? You should watch that interview or read the book. I don't actually care which one. Both, either, doesn't matter. But like, she provides an excellent explanation and defense and sort of just like nuanced take on this idea that Christians were super persecuted, and that they were persecuted because they were Christian and not for some other reason that quite literally had nothing to do with that. Um, anyway, I am jealous of you having lunch with her. I love her. I'm excited for you. Yeah. Anyway, we're here to talk about David, not King to the Mosque. Yes. So the genre of apologia or apology, whatever you want to call it, I'm not exactly sure the right way to phrase it. Many scholars, if I'm correct me if I'm wrong, will argue that sort of the narrative from the first time we hear about David to his taking the throne is kind of Davidic propaganda, right? Like it's trying to explain why David has a right to the throne, even though he has no right to the throne. And in doing this, it's also trying to downplay and sort of make Saul seem like he's this irrational, like jealous person who like
Yeah.
really we should all kind of like he needs to go, right? Like the text is trying to lead us into intuitively siding with David. And it does this, I think, in a number of ways. You know.
I think, and I think it's interesting the way the text does it too, because it represents David as entirely blameless and as like actively avoiding trying to take the throne
Right.
and blaming Saul's loss of the kingship on his own descent into madness. And
Right.
so it's saying all of the blame is on Saul. Dave is running hard in the other direction,
Dave.
and he just gets plucked up and chosen, which is exactly what you would do if the accusation were he took the throne that didn't belong to him. The story would be he was running hard in the other direction, and it was
Yeah.
entirely Saul's fault. So it fits that perfectly.
Yeah. And I thought it was interesting, something that I hadn't known. Sorry, Siri. Something that I hadn't known or thought about, or maybe I had known it kind of, but hadn't thought about it in detail, was like we all know Saul was the first king of Israel. But I think like what I hadn't thought about was like, okay, he was the first king of Israel, but like what does that mean? Like what were the tribes doing or the territories doing before he was the king, right? And so in reading this book, like we have these tribes that are all independent, and when they faced a threat from the outside, each tribe, if I'm remembering correctly, was sort of elect a judge, and then the judge goes forward and they sort of figure out who they're rallying behind, and then they defend themselves, and then everybody gets reabsorbed back into the tribes, and that's it. There's like no generational passing down or anything like that. If there's another existential external threat, and they do the whole thing over again. And so Saul, while being the first like king, really was just kind of the first like leader of a military alliance that wasn't sort of like it was constant. It wasn't like a all right, well that ended, now next.
Yeah.
And then he would pass it down to Jonathan, his son. And what I thought was really interesting, because I grew up evangelical and being told that like David was this warrior who was just like so great in battle and never lost and yada yada yada. What at least this book by Baden is saying is like David would have been from Judah. Judah was directly on, I don't remember if it was I think it's the southern border with the Philistines, right? And so like in order to get to sort of Saul's, I don't want to say his kingdom, he didn't have a kingdom, but like to get to Saul's sort of like territory, he would have to go through Judah. And so he argues that David would have been fighting defensive skirmishes all of the time or often. And so like these victories that we hear about in battle are not so much like he's not on the offensive, like capturing land or territories or whatever. He's just protecting Saul's more sort of like centralized area from the Philistines. Can you speak to that?
Yeah. So there are a handful of different theories about how the nation of Israel arose, and most scholars, definitely most critical scholars, are in pretty general agreement that it started in the northern kingdom,
Right.
that this kingdom was more or less the permanent kingdom as opposed to the confederation of tribes, the kind of seasonal, temporary confederation of tribes. The permanent kingdom was probably set up in order to defend these lands from the encroachment of the Philistines. And so this would have been 1150, 1100 ish, where they decide, okay, we need something permanent so that we can defend ourselves. And at the beginning, it's kind of a Potemkin village. We have the indications that there's no permanent settlement until somewhere in the 11th century BCE, where you start to see fortifications popping up on the cities that are around the boundaries of what we now understand to be the nation of Israel. And so this would basically be all the resources and the funds and the defenses are being sent out to the boundaries where the Philistines are going to be encountering them to try to project out strength and also defend those boundaries. But inside, they're not much of a kingdom at all.
Right.
So what they're trying to do is trying to mirror what they see in the larger kingdoms and empires around them. And these states that popped up around this time period, they're generally known as either secondary states or territorial states. It's basically when Egypt leaves and you have this power vacuum, all these city states are suddenly like, we're the big boys now. We're going to pretend to be what these empires around us have been to us. And so that's where Israel probably originated. There's an interesting book called The Land Before the Kingdom of Israel by Brendan C. Benz that puts together a pretty interesting discussion based on some stories from the book of Judges that are thought to be very, very early. But I'm fascinated by, and it's a part of one of the chapters in the book I'm working on right now, that period when Israel was just a loose confederation of tribes that basically confederated only when it was necessary to fight off somebody from the outside. We have the Merneptah Stele, which is from about 1209, which refers to Israel. So, in some sense, Israel exists at that time. But
Right.
because of the people determinative, that may be indicating this is not a permanent kingdom. This is just a bunch of people getting together saying, when we get together to fight off enemies, we are Israel, which would mean El contends. So this would be like the battle name. So we're gonna, whatever tribes unite, and together we are El contends, and that would just be the name of this temporary confederation. And so El would be the deity that oversees their confederation, but then when they're not together, they are whatever, and they worship whatever deities. So there's an argument to make that temporary confederation becomes permanent because of the pressure of the Philistines, and Israel later needs a king, and then we get Saul, and it's only in the north. And if you look at Judges 5, you have the list of people who were called upon to come do battle with by Deborah, and God chastises some of them for not showing up. But if you look at the list of all the tribes, it's not the 12 tribes of Israel. It's a pretty different set. And so, yeah, we've got something going on in that earlier period that is not what we have later on in the Bible. And most scholars would say that is an attempt to generate this fictive kinship, this idea that we were always like this. This is no new thing. And the story of David is definitely kind of a way to substantiate that, and a way to have David as a legitimate king in there.
Right. Correa, I saw your comment.
Hi, Correa.
Yes, message me. There's a reason that I haven't done that at this moment. So just message me. But yeah, I'm open to that. Something that I just don't want to talk about it publicly at this moment. Something that I thought was really interesting, because we don't fully know the sort of roots of Israel, is the arrival of the Philistines in like the 12th century BCE, right? So we have like the sea peoples that sort of arrive, and
Hmm.
it's a whole bunch of different people, but like we don't fully know all of them. But the Philistines come, or I think it's called the Pelashet.
Hmm.
That's the right word, yeah. And they sort of settle in the land of Canaan, and they start to spread. And so I don't know if you would call them the Israelites yet, because I don't know that they were like a fully formed thing, but they sort of get pushed away from the coast and into the like highlands.
Hmm.
Um, and so there's no clear delineation. There's no like clear borders. It's just like this open space between where the Philistines are settled and where Israel is settled. And so there's like constant skirmishes um, between the two. And so this idea of like, first, I just think this like discussing the idea of the sea peoples and like where the hell they came from and like what they're doing is interesting. I know I didn't mention that earlier, but it's something that I'm always like very interested in because it's kind of uh, ambiguous.
Hmm.
Um, but in Joel Baden's book, he does say this displacement is likely reflected in the stories about the tribe of Dan, and like I would have never known that. Like I would have never known it. Would have never thought about it. Like
Yeah.
so, it's just interesting.
Yeah, that's an interesting story. That's from Judges. You got 17 with Micah, who's got his little shrine, and then you've got the tribe of Dan, who's out looking for territory, and they come and they're like, "What does Adonai say?" And Micah's priest says, "Yeah, go up," and then they come back and they're like, "You're coming with us," and then Micah has to pursue them. And what I think is fascinating about it is, sure, we got this tribe of Dan that's looking for new territory, perhaps because they've been shoved out of the lowlands by the Philistines. But the story makes it sound like it's like an extended family. It's maybe a few dozen people. It's not. It's not an enormous nation of people. It's just a few dozen folks roaming around looking for a place to settle.
Right. Uh, So I guess my question is, do you think that stories like this about Dan, for instance, were intentionally kind of I don't want to say mythologized, but kind of like blown up a little bit to seem sort of larger than they were? Or is it that we are just sort of imparting like our own lens back on these stories?
Well, I think it's a little of both because I think the later generations that are transmitting these stories are imparting their own lenses back on these things. And as the foundation myth, and this is a scholarly term, it doesn't mean not true, but it just means the story we tell ourselves about where we came from, which can be
Right.
true and or false. When as this foundation myth develops, the no, I've been derailed. No, as this foundation myth develops, and they're trying to coordinate these stories, they've got to kind of rethink how they understand these stories, and so they're imposing their own lenses back on this and renegotiating the tradition. And I imagine that's what the story of the Exodus was as well. Very similar idea where we have something that may have started off very small scale, very limited, and the story was probably not very complex,
Right.
but every time you tell it, the story gets bigger, the events get bigger, the people get cooler, the villains get worse, and then after literally 1,000 years, we have what we have now in the Book of Exodus. So I'm sure that's what's going on even anciently as these stories are developing and growing.
Pharaoh's like looking down from a past life, like, I didn't do any of that. The hell?
Yeah, yeah.
Like, I was just trying to keep everybody in check. Uh, well, I think also something that I found super interesting. So in Joel Baden's book, and I'm talking a lot about his book because that's the one I'm reading right now, kind of working through. It's by
Hmm.
no means like, I'm not saying it's the only book anyone should ever read, but it is
Yeah,
the one that
yeah,
I am reading, and that's why I'm talking
yeah.
about it.
And
Um,
anybody, if I may interrupt, hold your
Please.
thought. But there are other good books. I mentioned the one by Jacob Wright, David, King of Israel, and Caleb in Biblical Memory. There's another one by Machari Leonard Fleckman called The House of David, Between Political Formation and Literary Revision. So
Oh,
anybody looking for other takes on this, those two books cover the same kind of stuff
yeah.
as well.
This is by
Sorry to
no means.
interrupt.
No, no, no. Please, please. And it's by no means me saying like this is the book that has all the answers. It's just it's quite literally the book that I'm reading right now, so it's fresh in my brain and it's like caused me to think about things. But like,
Hmm.
yeah, please, please don't think this is like the only book. It's just the one that I happen to be focused on at the moment. What I thought was interesting as well was he says that like, okay, so if we can say that this narrative is apologia, effectively, right? It's Davidic propaganda. Um, we can strip away, or at least attempt to strip away in an intelligent way, all of these sort of aspects that are propaganda, for lack of a better term, right? Like all of the things that would glorify David or denigrate Saul that seem to be done intentionally, strip all of those away, and then like we're left with some kind of like historical kernels. And what I thought was really interesting was he sort of takes us through the events of like David, when Saul like throws spears at him while he's like playing the lyre, right? Or when he like marries him off to his daughter, like all of these different things, or sends him to uh, the front lines of the battle, and he basically just sort of breaks them all down and is like, none of these make any sense. They didn't happen. I
Yeah,
mean, he doesn't say for sure. Obviously, he wasn't there, but he's like,
yeah,
it doesn't make sense that these things would have happened. Um, it makes way more sense that these things were created in order to puff David up.
yeah. And I think he refers to, I think he calls them literary creations or literary constructions or
Yeah.
something like that. And this is, and also this is a popular book. This is a trade volume intended for a
Yes.
popular audience. So Joel is also being a little bit more probably confident with the data than he would in a more academic setting.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
So where he says, you know, that didn't happen, I think I would be more comfortable saying it makes more sense that it happened this way than that it
Yes.
happened the other way.
So I will
And
say that he never says this didn't happen. That's like
right,
the
right, right. Yeah.
Jessica recap. Joel didn't say that. What
Yeah.
he says is it's likely that this didn't happen, or
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
likely that it didn't happen in this way. Like fully, I'm generalizing. He is much more careful than I am. Um, but like effectively he says like, here's the data, here's why it doesn't make sense that it would have
Right.
happened this way. It is likely that it did not happen this way. However, he nowhere does he say like it definitely didn't happen this way. And I think if you find
Yeah.
a book by a scholar that says it definitely didn't happen this way, you should throw it in the trash. My
Yeah.
opinion.
And this and these criteria are very similar to what people apply to the New Testament to try to determine weigh the likelihood of Jesus having existed, and then talking about what might be historical, what might not be. What parts of the story would directly and strongly serve the rhetorical goals of an author writing about this versus what parts of the story might not directly serve the author's rhetorical goals, but might need to be included or might, be widespread enough that they can't toss it out. Those kinds of things help us to weigh the probabilities and say it's more likely this is historical. It's more likely this is a literary creation. But yeah, David, there's a bunch of stuff that is, as they say, right out of central casting. Like if you were writing a crappy movie, this is how you would do it. And even the but then you have things like the story of David being a younger son and having to take the kingship by force. Like this is something that is we know from history all the way up to the medieval period, where the first son inherited everything.
Mm-hmm.
The other sons, they usually went into the clergy or they were warriors. They went into the military because they weren't going to be inheriting. They had no property to look forward to. We're going to have to make our living. We're going to have to find a livelihood elsewhere. And so the military leader who, was robbed of their kingship because they were the younger son, going and taking back kingship, like that's pretty stereotypical, but also we know that kind of thing happened all the time historically. So it makes
Yeah.
sense as the way this probably really went down.
Right. Well, I mean, I don't remember exact examples at the moment, but I think if you look at like ancient Mesopotamia, you see this a lot, where people like usurp the throne that have no right to the throne, and then like make up some reason why they did it, and it's
Right,
like,
right.
all right, cool, I guess.
And it
Um,
usually has something to do with, well, the deity put me here. The deity wanted me here. That's the ultimate
how do you argue with
validation.
that?
Yeah. And
Yeah.
that's probably why in my discussions of Adonai and El being conflated, it was probably a king, somebody who rose to the throne who was a devotee of Adonai, but then was like, "Oh, didn't you hear? Adonai is El. You're already worshiping my
Oh, look
my
at that.
deity, and so I'm totally
That's so
I'm good."
convenient.
Yeah, it's very convenient. So
Yeah.
I think that's that's going on a lot of the time, but for devotional readers of the text, they don't want to apply that kind of critical lens
Yeah.
because that undermines the way the text is supposed to function um, for in a devotional confessional context. So,
Yeah.
it's
Don't tell the evangelicals. Um, just joined. Wait, so is David real or fiction? Both. Both.
yeah. I think
Neither. Both.
Baden's discussion, he says he thinks it's more likely that David was real because of all these aspects of the story that don't make sense in within the rhetorical
Sure.
goals, but then there are aspects of the story that are very clearly literary
Yeah.
creations.
So I have not finished his book. The vibe that I get from it is that Baden would argue David existed, but that like largely many of the things that are attributed to him are kind of like these mythologized sort of accounts of things, right? So
Mm-hmm.
we were talking earlier about the Battle of David and Goliath and how it appears to largely borrow both like the narrative arc and the finer points from these two brothers from Bethlehem, who the Bible talks about Elhanan killing Goliath, and then
Yeah.
Eleazar, I believe, was, I forget exactly what it was, the sort of
He
location
was
of
the
the
one
battle.
who the location of the battle, but also he was the one who stayed when all of Israel fled, and then
Right, right,
he
right, right.
fought off the Philistines.
Yeah.
Um,
And so Baden kind of asked, like, what's more likely that, like, David, who did something really grand and glorious, had that glory then split between two relatively unknown, like,
yeah,
Hebrew Bible characters that are, like, barely that, right? Like, they're in the Hebrew Bible characters, but nobody cares. Nobody's ever heard of them. Like,
yeah,
or is it more likely that these two brothers from Bethlehem had their sort of like battle wins combined, mythologized, and attributed to David,
right.
you know?
And it's very similar to how we talk about textual changes. What's
Right.
more likely that an editor changed it to something more theologically problematic or more misaligned with the rest of the text, or is it more likely it went from more theologically problematic to less theologically problematic? It's very similar here. Is it more likely a bunch of different acts done by unknowns were consolidated in our big important central figure, or more likely that it went the other direction, and that helps us to figure out what's more likely original. And so Elhanan in 2 Samuel 21:19 kills Goliath, and it even describes Goliath as the one whose spear was like a weaver's beam,
Right.
which is word for word exactly how it's described in 1 Samuel 17.
Yeah.
And yeah, and then Eleazar is the one who's doing the same kind of thing, standing out all by himself against the Philistine army in the same spot. And so,
Yeah.
and that kind of thing happens all over the Bible. And I really enjoy the doublet that Joel talks about. where you're introduced to David twice, and Saul is introduced to David twice. It's like, come and listen to my story about this kid named David. He was this, that, and the other, and he did this, and then Saul made him a part of his household. Now come and listen to my story about this dude named David, and he was this, that, and the other. And Saul was like, "Who's that kid?" And so he likes him, and he put him in his household, and it's just telling the same story over again. And those doublets occur all over the Hebrew Bible as well. Indications that these are independent stories that an editor decided we're gonna slap those two
figure out a
together.
way to like make this make sense.
Yeah, and sometimes it's just one after the other, like we find in First Samuel. Sometimes they're woven together, like the story of Joseph being sold into slavery in Egypt,
One of my
where
favorites.
it's like Ishmaelites to Midianites to Ishmaelites to Midianites, and we got two beginnings, two middles, two ends.
It's like that meme where the guy has like the board in the back, and it's like all the red string, and he's like looks like half crazed. Like that's what that reminds me of when you're trying to make sense. And they're like, yeah, I guess it's possible, but that seems incredibly unlikely. It seems more likely that somebody was just trying to make these two like accounts make sense in some way.
Yeah,
I don't know.
And that's where the law of parsimony comes in, and the idea that the conclusion that requires the fewest assumptions, that creates the fewest additional problems, the conclusion that requires the fewest variables to figure out is probably the real one. That's the most likely one.
Right.
And yeah, but apologetic attempts to say, well, it's possible that this happened, and then it's possible that this other thing was happening over here at the same time, and we weren't told about it, and then it's also possible this. And it's like, you're asking me to accept a dozen totally implausible, but not physically impossible events to have aligned perfectly for all this to have come together, but the authors just didn't mention any of that and told the story in a completely different way.
Yeah,
but
obviously.
And that's, yeah, and which is just performance for people who want to believe.
Yeah, so long
just
as it's
need
possible.
To be.
That's
yeah,
all they
if
care
you
about.
can just crack the door enough to let a little tiny sliver of light come through, that's all I need to feel like everything's true.
I mean, that's apologetics.
Yeah, that's apologetics in a nutshell. Is gin up for me the tiniest little sliver of not impossible, and I win. And so, which is phenomenally frustrating.
Yeah, that is a good way to put it. It is phenomenally frustrating. This is part of the reason that I don't even like debate apologists, because like as an atheist or just as someone who takes a critical approach to the Bible, I actually don't care what your like anyone's personal beliefs are, but as someone who takes like an intellectually honest approach to the Bible, you are obligated to sort of like provide evidence that you can't possibly ever provide, right? It's like go back in time and like prove that this happened. Like, okay, that's impossible. Meanwhile, the apologists just have to be like, it could have happened this way. And then like the people that are watching for that are just like, oh, that's all I need. That resolves my cognitive dissonance. We're good. And like, I don't need to be doing all that. Like, it's a lot. It's tiring.
Yeah, and it's funny because it's historically contingent too. If you go look back at the history of these things, it's like what made the text okay 500 years ago didn't work 200 years ago. They had to come up with a different explanation, and now we got to come up with still a different explanation. But every time it's like we've discovered the reality of this. This is how it is.
We're just writing our own versions over and over and over again.
Yeah.
It's like when you harmonize the Gospels, right? You just create a new gospel. None of the Gospels say this, but we've decided when we harmonize it, this is what they actually mean. Like, all right, cool. The gospel according to like me.
Hang on, just 1 second. What's
You're
that? Good. Oh. Okay. There you go.
You have two daughters?
I have 3 daughters.
3 daughters.
Yeah. 14, 10, almost 11. Like 11 in 3 days.
Wow.
And 5. So
yeah, it's almost like me and my siblings. There's 5 of us, 5 daughters. Praying for you. uh,
Oh, I love it. I have no problem whatsoever. Um it's such a treat. But yeah, they're spread out in a way that like I think like every 4 years it's like being in a different family, they say. And so it's I basically we have three different families
yeah,
made up of one child each.
fair
And
enough.
so
Fair enough. Yeah, I'm the oldest, and I'm
thanks, Matt. I
33,
appreciate it.
going on 34, and the youngest is 16, going on 17. So like, there's a there's a lot
There's
going
quite a
on.
gap. Well,
Yeah.
the person I took to prom when I was a senior in high school had a 42-year-old brother. And that
That's
is a
a lot.
weird thing to say now that I am 42.
Yeah, it's a lot. At least you're not on TikTok, or not TikTok. At least you're not on Twitter trying to just. Did you see those tweets where this multiple men were trying to justify being attracted to like 16-year-old
Oh,
girls?
that's yeah, that
I was
tale
like,
as old as time.
let me just go
Um,
die. Like
yeah,
that's let me just, please God, just take me
I
out back.
mean, you're really telling on yourself when you like swoop into the defense of somebody and be like, it's only natural that we would be attracted to a 13-year-old.
This is all
And
I'm
it's like,
saying.
hey,
Like,
buddy, you don't have to show those cards.
yeah, like the FBI is on their way. Because as a woman, because this guy, and we can get back to the subject at hand, but the two guys were saying like, well, men are attracted to like fertility, and like women are attracted to emotional intelligence. And I was like, well, if that's true, how do I ever date? Because because it's rough out here. But but also like, what?
Condolences. Yeah.
Yeah, it's all right. I know a couple of good guys. Um, but all jokes aside, it's like I'm 33. When I meet a man who's 25, that's a child. Like there's just absolutely Chris Hansen has entered the chat. um, there's no way on God's green earth that a 25, 20, 30-year old could ask me out and I would want to go.
Yeah.
I don't know how to explain it. Just couldn't happen. Anyway, David would do it. You know what I mean? He had no concept of that.
Yeah. Well, that and that brings up the other thing Jill talks about is why we would have later on this reference to David having this wife. Oh, by the way, there was his first wife, Ahinoam, that we're not going to talk about. But that happens to also be the name of one of Saul's wives, who suddenly vanishes from the narrative as soon
Oh,
as Dave takes over as
wow.
king. So, yeah,
Did not think Dave.
he he was he was fond of that 5 finger discount on wives too. So.
But didn't
Um,
he also marry Saul's daughter?
yeah, Michal.
Oh yeah. And then
Yeah.
she doesn't go with him when he goes into exile. She's just like, nah, like it was cool, but I don't support you that much. Like,
Yeah,
oh,
and his little stint as his roughing it with the Philistines as a mercenary is a lot of people are like, well, it sounds like that's how David got to the throne. He was like, come on, guys, we're gonna go raid the village and um
David
I'm thinking
slipping
of
into the DMs.
I'm thinking of no, I
Sorry.
was just thinking of Three Amigos. Grape the horses and ride off on the women.
I mean, honestly, like I get why they can't write that down, but that's a more interesting story. Like if
Yeah,
David was like
yeah.
some assassin that was like, yo, I don't really like you guys, you don't really like me, but like I have a goal, a plan, an ambition. And then we can part ways once I've done that, and like I'll pay you off some amount of things. Like I would respect that.
Somebody's asking, will you answer questions during this live? It's kind of a discussion right now, so I don't know if you're getting any questions or if you've even noticed
I've had a couple of
on your
questions.
feed.
Yeah, and I am happy. I feel like I say we, you should probably answer questions. I will be just making dumb jokes and quips. But yeah, happy to like answer questions.
Yeah.
If there's no questions, happy to continue just the chat. So, up to you.
I did see one that I think somebody's posted a couple of times. When do I think the Hebrew Bible is finalized?
Ooh.
Which is interesting. Yeah, that's going to be part of my upcoming online class on April 6th on how the biblical canon developed. But it was probably not until like all the texts that we currently have in the biblical Hebrew canon probably weren't finalized until around the first century BCE into the first century CE. Like we find some discussion about
Sorry.
uh, we find some discussion at the end of the first century CE, according to some later Talmudic texts, about whether or not texts like Ecclesiastes and the Song of Songs defile the hands, which is the Jewish way of referring to a text being inspired or authoritative. The idea being that this is holy, and therefore to touch it outside of a holy context defiles the toucher. And so some texts don't defile your hands, but the holy texts, the ones that were inspired, those do defile your hands. And so that's the Jewish concept. But some of the texts are still being written in the second century BCE. The book of Daniel was written around 164-ish BCE, and other texts are still being edited. And even into the Common Era, around the time of the creation of the New Testament, there are texts that are still being edited in smaller ways. The edits are fewer and farther between. But I would say we don't have the text exactly as we know it today until like the medieval period. So
I would
it
love to do a chat on the Book of Daniel.
it's such a fascinating text. There's so much to it, and as with so many things, it's so much more fascinating when you actually look at it from a critical point of view and try to understand what it's trying to do.
Someone asked me to please tell Dr. Mack, that's you, that Dr. Shively at St. Andrews admires his scholarship.
Oh, well, thank you so much. I appreciate that. And I have to know this person. School of Divinity, Apocalyptic Imagination in the Gospel of Mark. I know I probably have met this person before,
I'm the
but
messenger, you know.
well, I appreciate that. It is always nice to hear that. And oh gosh, I love St. Andrews. Have you ever been to St. Andrews?
Where is it?
Scotland.
No. I've
So
been to whatever the like main university in Ireland is, but not Scotland.
okay, so it's Scotland's just a gorgeous place, but St. Andrews, wonderful, wonderful town. I've played golf there. That's kind of like my golf Disneyland. And then the university is phenomenal too, and I have some wonderful friends there. And so Dr. Shively probably knows Madhavi Navatar, who was an instructor. I wasn't in her class at Oxford, but we became friends, and I kind of audited one of her classes at Oxford, and I'm pretty sure she's still at St. Andrews.
Yes, this
But
person says, thank you. She teaches my New Testament Greek module.
awesome. Well, I'm flattered and humbled. So thank you for passing that along, and tell her hi for me. And I hope to be in St. Andrews sometime soon. So
I need to
if
know,
I will let her know if I am, so she can say hi.
does every man above the age of 30 play golf?
No,
because every man
there.
I know above the age of no, that's not true. There's a couple of guys that I know that don't.
So I found I golf for me, I grew up loving it because my dad, when I turned 10, started pulling me out of school like one day a month to go
Oh
play
hell yeah!
golf with him. So that was phenomenal. And then when I got into high school, I was like, there's a golf team. I can go play golf for free
This is a
on a
sport.
team. Yeah. And I tried out for the team and I shot a million. I just didn't even come close. And then I got a job at a country club over the summer, and so I made varsity the rest of my high school career, and just fell in love with the game. So my brothers and my dad and I have always played golf, but I know a bunch of people my age who are like, I've never played golf.
There's certainly no judgment. I just feel like maybe I'm just in the circles where like this is what happens, and I'm like,
Yeah.
I don't get it, but love that for you guys.
Well, you're
in the bar. You know what I mean?
You run in athletic circles to some degree.
That's true. I
Yeah.
have this weird overlap of like athletic and also like intellectual circles. Um, and somehow that always ends up with me drinking white wine somewhere, which I'm like fully behind. Like, love it, love that for me. It's my athletic endeavor, you know. Um, I'm a weightlifter, but not right then. All right, let's see. Uh, that's a question that I don't think we can answer today, but maybe some other time. Uh, could you ask him if he could do a full dive into the beliefs of Christians just based off the Bible? Like that's a
I
ginormous
don't know exactly what that, because a lot of
because they be
Christians
making
have
shit up.
beliefs. Yeah, there are a lot of beliefs that kind of develop organically within a social group that then get aligned with the Bible or read into the Bible. So yeah, that's a difficult question.
Yeah.
Um,
Someone asked, "Does Dan ever discuss his own beliefs or lack thereof?" And I'm going to answer for you, no.
Not
Uh,
publicly, yeah.
Thank you so much for coming to our TED Talk. It's nothing personal. It's just no. That's all.
And I get messages quite a bit. TikTok now lets people, DM everybody or message requests
You
anyway.
can
So I
turn that
get,
off. You know that, right?
can you?
You can.
I feel so bad turning it off,
You
but
should do it.
I glance at it every now and then. I don't nearly have enough time to go through all of it, much less respond to everything. But people ask me that all the time. They DM me on Instagram. I turned off my DMs on Twitter, but I get that question all the time. And it's just, if I'm not close personal friends with you, I'm not gonna talk about it, particularly not
Listen,
in public.
I consider Dan, and I don't know what he considers me. I consider Dan to be like a friend of mine. Um, and we have not discussed his personal beliefs, largely because I don't care. But
Yeah.
like also just so everyone knows. Um what's the other thing I was gonna say? Personal messages. Oh, I was gonna say you get personal messages about your like what do you believe? I get personal messages about how small my hands are,
Oh yeah, about your
and my
appearance,
feet.
your feet.
Oh yeah, yeah, my
Oh,
feet,
that.
and whether or not I sell certain things. We'll leave it there. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
love it.
Uh, Here's an interesting question. To what extent New Testament texts are a response to OT texts?
Hmm.
I think in a lot of ways, the New Testament is reflecting the Hebrew Bible.
I'm
It
gonna
is
turn this light
trying,
on. Go ahead.
it is telling this story in a way so as to say this fits the genre, the expectations, the prophecies, a lot of the symbols, a lot of the typology from the Hebrew Bible, and so it's not so much a response as a refraction of the Hebrew Bible, and trying to better understand what's going on in that relationship. I think is fascinating research. In fact, I think there was just a book that came, a newer, there have been a handful of Old Testament and the New Testament books, but there was I think a new one just came out recently, and I don't. Man, Google's the worst. Why is the Gospel Coalition coming up?
Money.
Yeah, well, um, but every now and then a book on that gets published, and I think there's a lot of cool stuff to learn in there. So I wouldn't say a response. In some ways, there are some things that are responses, but for the most part, it's just trying to deploy the symbols and the themes and the ideas and carry them on
There's a
in the New Testament.
book that I have not finished but started to read called Helping Jesus Fulfill Prophecy, I believe. Um, I think it's Helping Jesus Fulfill Prophecy.
Robert J. Miller.
I think so. From what I have read, it was really interesting. I'm obviously not a scholar. I cannot say how like sort of academically rigorous it is, but I do think it's worth considering that the people that wrote the Gospels, at least, and probably also Paul, had an understanding of the Hebrew Bible.
Yeah,
Like,
and this is something I get a lot. People will say, "Well, Jewish people don't believe this. Jewish people don't believe that." Not since the rise of rabbinic Judaism, but first century Judaism is very different today. And so there's a point at which the two groups kind of converge. And when that happens and how is still hotly debated.
Yeah.
But Greco-Roman period Judaism is a lot different from rabbinic Judaism and contemporary Judaism. And so there are things that got preserved from Greco-Roman period Judaism within Christianity, and so became something that rabbinic Judaism distanced itself from, but that was thoroughly a part of earlier generations of Jewish people. So it's a complex story, but I think phenomenally fascinating.
Yeah, I would agree with that based on my own like crummy research.
Books on that period of Judaism? Ooh, there are so many. Actually, just a second. I was just peeking at one earlier today that I am not going to be able to find again because, oh, here we go.
You can do it.
This is an interesting one by Lee I. Levine, Judaism and Hellenism in Antiquity, Conflict or Confluence. So that's an interesting discussion of Hellenistic Judaism. And then John Collins wrote a book called Athens and Jerusalem. So
John
that's
Collins is the GOAT.
John Collins is the GOAT. If you want the definitive discussion of the book of Daniel, John Collins's Hermeneia commentary is the best in that regard. But yeah, so that's based on this saying in the early Christianity. Somebody said, "What hath Athens to do with Jerusalem?" Suggesting that Christianity and Greco-Roman philosophical thought are totally at odds. And this book is really a discussion about how that's not quite accurate. So
yeah.
Um,
So I am going to ask a question that has nothing to do with Daniel, maybe, but not really. I am a big Paul hater. You know what I mean? Like, I'm not a fan of Paul. Maybe I'm not a Paul hater. I take issue with the fact that Christians seem to be more interested in following and modeling and kind of like elevating Paul as opposed to Jesus, right?
mm-hmm.
So I'm just generally interested in your sort of take on on Paul generally, right? Like, he never met Jesus. He said that he saw him in a vision. Like, okay, but also, like, I'm interested in your take on him as a at least previously Jewish person. I think probably would still have considered himself Jewish in some ways. Yeah.
So I think Paul is the means of spreading Christianity a lot further than it probably would have spread in his absence, but also the intellectualization of Christianity, and Paul kind of handed it off to the apologists of the second century. But I think today Paul is prominent because of the Protestant Reformation, and because Paul is the poster child for faith and not works. And it would be a very different story if the Protestant Reformation never happened. And our concept of religion would be entirely different as well as so much of our intellectual history without the Protestant Reformation, without the way that fed into and engaged with the Enlightenment. So I think Paul's prominence today is probably more a product of Protestantism than it is of the fact that he was the primary missionary for the church. But yeah, definitely the spread of Christianity to the Gentile world would not have happened in anything to the degree it did happen without Paul. But at the same time, Paul's trying to thread a needle that is just impossible to thread with his attempt to try to take the Jewish idea of salvation and works and the law and all this kind of stuff, and then take the Christian gospel and kind of turn it into something new. Paul's not my cup of tea either.
I did not mean to imply that.
No. And I think there are a lot of discussions going on regarding Paul right now. I think most of the scholars I know and whose opinions I appreciate are not very fond of the direction a lot of it's heading, are not very fond of some of the prominent voices, such as N.T. Wright and others. But
I mean, anything
Yeah.
N.T. Wright doesn't like is like Marxist, or so I've heard. Um, so I've heard, you know.
Yeah.
In any event, yeah, I guess I've always just struggled with Paul because it's like, what? Like what? What? Like you didn't even know Jesus, and oftentimes the like things that he presents seem to be kind of at odds with things that Jesus preached, and so it's like,
Yeah.
what are we doing? Like, and I wonder, and I was talking about this with Andrew Mark Henry. I interviewed him the other day. Like, how would Paul feel about like his angry letter to the Galatians being canonized, right? Like, would
Yeah.
he be like happy about it? Would he be upset? And like, my personal opinion is that he would pretend to be offended, but inside he would be like, and I don't know that. That's just my opinion. But yeah, I have thoughts about Paul. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. And a lot of scholars talk about the way Paul's writing kind of progresses and develops from the earlier text to the later text. And I look at some of my early scholarship and cringe. And so I got to imagine that he was like, no, not First Thessalonians. Um,
Paul's like, what the fuck are you guys doing? You did what? Yeah.
you didn't even keep the letter I wrote correcting all that stuff. So,
Yeah. I mean,
yeah,
and I do think that's probably also true, right? Like we've kind of I don't want to say idolized, but I don't know what the word is. We have decided that these are the things that Paul wrote and these are the things that matter, and we don't know what's lost. We don't know if there was corrections. We don't know
yeah,
if he had like other thoughts. We're just sort of creating our own narrative
yeah.
out of what's left over. And I don't think that's ever fair to probably the original author or the original intent, but like
Yeah.
it's what we have.
I
So
I was I was on a podcast recently, and I think it was called Profoundly Pointless.
oh yeah, I saw
And
that.
there was at one point the host asked how much of this we have got wrong, and it was like
Probably
probably
all of it.
most of it. Yeah,
Yeah.
because somebody like Paul or even Jesus, if they could be brought back to life and be shown all of this, it would blow their minds, and they would probably be like, "You missed 95% of
Y'all
this."
suck so
And
bad.
yeah,
Um
and
yeah.
the accident of preservation is so arbitrary, but is so like determinative.
Yeah.
Like we could be missing one thing that could change it all, and that could tie everything all back together, or could blow it all apart. But we have no idea. It's not even there.
Yeah.
So
So another kind of related question that's mine. My sort of deconstruction started when I examined the four gospels and realized that like what I had been told about them was just like not true.
hmm
And so as I sort of did research and continued to learn, um, it seemed like the scholarly consensus was that there is this kind of earlier source of Q that we don't have, but we assume the Gospels kind of drew on.
uh-huh.
I have seen other perspectives that don't agree with this, and I'm just wondering sort of where you fall on that.
I think Mark Goodacre is probably one of
Yes.
the more prominent defenders of another theory. You have the Farrer hypothesis as well. We have to have there have to be sources out there that we just don't have
Right.
anymore. That it all comes down to one Q source. I'm not totally sold on, but that's also not really my specialization. So
Fair.
I just kind of observe and say this is what they're saying, that's what they're saying. I don't have strong feelings about it right now. I know Mark. Mark's a friend of mine, and I respect him. Respect the crap out of what he does, and so if I'm forced, I will side with Mark. Um, but
Yeah.
yeah, it's a fascinating discussion, and at some point I got to dedicate more time to coming up with an opinion on it because I know there are sources we don't have, but and it's a possibility that the Gospel of Thomas preserves some sayings that may be from one of those earlier sources, or maybe not. I don't know.
Yeah.
Um, all right, I'm going to have to start wrapping it up
Yeah.
shortly.
Works for me. Are there any more questions in your chat? Because I've just been asking my own questions.
Let me see. Um, there's a lot of. Do we have any physical texts that were found earlier than the third century CE? We do have a couple of fragments of New Testament manuscripts that come from the second century CE. We have nothing from the first century. When it comes to Hebrew Bible, we have a ton of stuff in the Dead Sea Scrolls that date to between 250 BCE and about 68 CE. We also have some Septuagint manuscripts that date to in that time period as well. But the single oldest physical text that we have from anything that is in the Bible dates to about 600 BCE. And they're two little tiny silver scrolls that had a portion of the priestly blessing from the book of Numbers inscribed onto these silver scrolls, rolled up tight, and kept in a little amulet that somebody would have worn around their neck as an apotropaic amulet, a way to ward off evil. And so it shows an interesting function of that physical text before it likely was incorporated into what we now know as the Torah. So that probably predates the completion of the book of Numbers by centuries, and definitely predates the coming together of the Torah. So you got that one little fragment from about 600 BCE, and then you go 350 years into the future to around 250 BCE to the Dead Sea Scrolls, and that's what you have. But for New Testament, a couple of fragments from the second century, a
That's
handful
wild.
more from the third century, and then fourth century is when it starts to take off with our manuscripts.
It's just so wild to me that like we a lot of us have based our entire belief system off of copies of copies of copies. Like, but all right, it's fine. No, it's fine.
Yeah, and the earlier in time you go, the more variation there
Yeah.
are between the various copies of the same text. And it's right around the turn of the era, right? First century BCE into the first century CE, into the second century CE is where you start to see a shift towards wanting a standardized text, not tolerating all the variation,
Yeah.
but funneling everything into one standard version. And I think that coincides with the text's kind of arrogation of authority. Prior to that, the authority is the words, and primarily the words as they're spoken and as
Right.
they're heard, not the words as they're written on papyrus or on
Because like
stone.
nobody could read them. I mean, a couple of people could, but like not very many.
Yeah. But when you look at the earliest Christians talking about the gospel message, they don't talk about the texts. They talk about the words of Jesus. And that's the locus of authority. That's where the authority is. And so you have a bunch of words of Jesus that are not written down. They're called the agrapha, the unwritten things. And those have just as much authority. And then by the second century CE, it's kind of like, we're just going to do it all with text. And that becomes the locus of authority. And so yeah, I think that has a lot to do with how we reconstruct the development and the change in the text. Is the fact that prior to that, it was it was somewhat a free for all, which is why we have the books of Chronicles, because they just took the earlier stuff and said, "Nah, we're not going to do that. We're
So
gonna
we're
we're
gonna
gonna do
fix
this
this.
over again." Yeah,
Yeah, don't worry
yeah,
about it. We'll figure it out. Just ignore everything else.
yeah.
It's fine. All right.
All right. Well, thank you everybody in the chat for asking
Thank
questions
you.
that I largely did not answer. I apologize again, but
No, you did
um,
great.
yeah,
Thank you for being here. Thanks for
thanks for the
being willing to do it
invitation.
again. Of course. It's always a hit, even though I'm just here with no expertise whatsoever. So like anytime, I'm happy to do it. I love doing it. It's interesting. I learn. People seem to enjoy it. thank you for doing it. Thank you for being here and for lending us your brain power
Well,
and your
thank you.
time.
I appreciate your time and attention, and I appreciate the opportunity to share some thoughts and to rant for a little while, which is what unfortunately I am far too fond of doing.
No, it's fine. I will invite you to do it again. Never fear. Uh,
All right.
all right,
All right.
y'all.
Have a wonderful night. Good night, everybody. Hope
Good
you
night.
have people you love around you that you can go hug or whatever and enjoy a happy and safe night.
I will
And
also be downloading this live and posting it to YouTube. If you just got here or whatever, it'll be up there so y'all can watch the whole thing if you want to. Also, someone said Dan is the Sheldon of real life, and love it. Except for like not annoying and rude.
yeah, there's
Like
and my flag knowledge is subpar. So I can yeah.
we love Dan. We're Dan stands here. Thank you so much, and I will post this to YouTube. And I'm going to the University of Chicago.
Congratulations. You're
Thank
gonna
you.
have so much fun.
I can't wait. I can't wait. All right.
All
I'll
right.
see
Have
y'all
a good
next
night,
time.
everybody.
You too.
See ya.
Thanks again. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.